Hi, friends. Host Eric here, host Talking with Famous People, also known as Eric Strauss, candidate for president of 2020. And I'm sitting here chit-chatting with Ice Whiskey ENFP 7W8, which is to say, he's an angry player. He likes to play, and he likes to be angry all of the time.
Rawr.
There it is. There's that textbook anger. Go ahead, Brittany.
It seemed like you were more angry than he was.
About what?
I don't know. When you were talking, you scared me. I've never seen you get so emotional. Like, not saying you were out of control emotional, but you were using a lot of emotions, and I've never seen that.
Well, I was getting a little bit upset at hearing.
Not that I didn't believe it, because you're always like pretty peaceful, you know.
Well, I was hearing about England's oppressive.
That's when I see stuff like that.
Suppose anger can get confused with passion a lot of the time.
Passion? What do you mean confused? Like emotion and passion, I think they're pretty interconnected.
Passion can come across as anger because you raise your voice, you get adrenaline.
Yes. A lot of people will call me angry when I'm not angry. I'm just expressing shit, like really aggressively.
Mr. Eric here was very passionate.
Yes, he was.
Okay, so let's go back a bit here.
You're defining like his content as anger, like upsetness towards something, not his demeanor.
Okay, let's talk about what we're actually talking about here. Since I started a video a second ago, right before you joined back in here, Brittany. I want to discuss this issue of free speech of Europe and the way that they're implementing policies based on political ideology that prioritizes a relationship with culture that I think ignores some basic realities. Brittany, I'm getting a little bit of feedback from you, I think. Can you mute your mic? I mean, you're not talking.
Oh, was that me?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, thanks. So anyway, Ice Whiskey ENFP, and I've had a couple of other people in England express to me that in Europe there are hate speech laws that mean if you post something on Facebook that say anti-Islam, then you run the risk potentially being prosecuted, and that the prioritization there is over the fact that you can't, quote unquote, can't collectivize Muslims. You can't treat them as a monolithic group that each of whom expresses the identity of Islam and not their individual identity. We need to treat them as people first. Okay, well, the problem with this sort of argument is that it takes what is true, that when dealing with individuals, we have to deal with them as individuals first and not as examples of any group. It takes what's true and tries to apply it to something where it doesn't work. Just because it's true that we need to treat individuals as individuals and not reduce them to members of their group does not mean it's true that we can't make critiques about group dynamics, group politics, group or cultural expressions, and things like that. Because to fail to do that is to fail to distinguish between the individual and the idea. So even though any individual expresses or believes, manifests, relates to an idea as an expression of their individuality, the ideas themselves exist external to the individuals such that we can critique them by a language. It is fair and reasonable then for any individual to critique Islam or the expression of Islam by Muslims in general as it's expressed in the Middle East or in the Islamic world in general, and discuss the natures in which Islamic culture produces values that run afoul of the values of the West. I can make these critiques of Islam and make these critiques of Muslims in general without actually saying that any given individual Muslim ought to be critiqued according to these same metrics. In fact, I make the exact opposite argument, that every individual Muslim ought not be critiqued according to those metrics, but ought to be treated as an individual first. And to the extent that their expression as an individual runs afoul of core limiting principles that form the values of the West, then we ought to be concerned. Okay, so in making a critique of Islam, we are saying there are good critiques and bad critiques. One of the most common is one of the worst. To say, for example, that a given country ought not allow Islamic immigration because of terrorism is a very poor critique of Islam, and it's a very poor understanding of public policy. While it's true it may be true that we ought not allow Islamic immigration, it's not true that it's because of terrorism. First of all, the distinction between what constitutes terrorism and what constitutes some random act of criminal violence at a given scale is meaningless. There's no real distinction there. It says, well, it's politically or religiously motivated violence instead of what? A mass shooting for no reason like happened in the US in Vegas? To me, they're equivalent. They're acts of mass criminal violence. It doesn't matter what the motivational framework is, really. So that's a bad reason to not admit Muslims, because they're no more likely to commit mass violence than anybody else if we consider all forms of mass violence and we recognize the fact that there's plenty of groups politically motivated in the world to commit mass violence. We don't prevent all Norwegians from immigrating just because there's some segue of some section of Norwegian culture that is militaristic or something. Regardless, that's a poor reason to use, and it plays into a lot of political misconceptions. And also, terrorism's not a very big problem. In other words, compared to other ways that people die in society, it's very, very low on the list. Good reasons.
Christianity's been guilty of terrorism as well, like the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, that's a good example.
Okay, well, and see, this is another area where we need to sort of speak carefully regarding religion and terrorism and violence and stuff. To critique Islam for a given thing is not to say that Christianity is fundamentally better or doesn't do that. I'm not saying that Christianity expresses perfectly either. I'm not saying that Christianity is better than Islam. I'm not saying anything at all about Christianity. I'm just saying that when critiquing Islam, tendency towards violence is not a good criterion to use. It's possible that Christianity was correlated with violence more in the past. I don't believe right now that it correlates with justifying violence as much as Islam does. I'm just saying that that's not a very strong reason to. You can still use it, but it typically is afforded weight beyond that which it ought to be afforded. I think much more important arguments regarding critiques of Islam are critiques of the structural acceptance of transgression towards women, and just generally the way that Islam positions women as basically chattel or second-class citizens, people of reduced rights, not equally human, etc. So the misogyny implicit in Islam as it's practiced normally in the Muslim world across the board in general today, not extremists, but just sort of the general middle ground, is an unacceptable expression of culture if we want it to be consistent with Western values. The other critique I would make is that there's a prioritization of the sacred as understood by Islam over the secular right of the individual of freedom of conscience and freedom of expression. So this displays itself in the bombing of that magazine in France, and it's really quite tragic, but that's critically important. I mean, as Westerners, we have an obligation to not bend to any pressure to control our own free expression to conform to Islamic law regarding that. Now, what I've talked about so far are two separate things. I've talked about the importance of us as individuals interacting with individuals of whatever faith, color, creed, gender, whatever, as individuals, and not reducing individual people to members of a group. So if I'm interacting with an individual human being, I'm not interacting with a Muslim, I'm not interacting with a Christian, I'm not interacting with a woman, I'm not interacting with a young person or an old person, I'm interacting with a human being, period. and I need to treat them as such. And I need to value them and their individuality as such. And also, if I'm talking about immigration policy in general, I need to respect the fact that there are cultural distinctions that can cause a conflict. So, one such cultural distinction that can cause a conflict is attitude towards women. Men from Islamic cultures tend to, if you're talking again as a general rule, tend to express a certain attitude towards women that runs afoul of the core values of Western culture. And those core values include things like equal autonomy, that each individual has an equal implicit right to decide their own course and their own expression of self and not conform to a societal norm. That's a value that we hold precious because to the extent that we're allowed to express ourselves freely in a culture that is tolerant of many different expressions of self, and we have a clear, bright line to distinguish when an expression of self is legitimate and when it's not, and that it being transgression, then we discover that, in fact, society grows richer, it grows more meaningful, that everybody learns from everybody else, that individuals optimize towards individual respect of individualism, that there's less violence, that there's less conflict, that there's less strife, etc. Okay, so to the extent that a culture represents a prioritization of its own definition of the sacred over the rights of other individuals to express things contrary to that sacred, that force is a deeply harmful one to a civil society like America or Europe, Western Europe. We ought to make sure that whatever our immigration policy is, it accounts for the cancerous effect of those cultural elements upon our civil society. In other words, we don't want to do things as public policy that produce a society that is more prone to legitimize violence against women or more prone to legitimize violence in response to free expression. And if in fact our immigration policy makes those harms more likely, that we ought to change it to make it less likely. Remember, unlike most public policy, immigration policy is you're dealing with people who do not have an inherent right to go there. As a sovereign nation, your borders are your concern. And being a sovereign nation means saying, if you want to come here, you prove to us that you are providing us value, and then you can come here. Because that's what the fact that you want to come here means we have a resource. One of our resources of the nation is it's a desirable place for immigrants to come. So we can build the wealth of the nation and the power and the success and the prosperity of the nation by incorporating immigrants who help to do that, and by preventing immigration to those who won't do that. We have to find some criteria to make a distinction that says, yes, you are providing value, and thus that's why we're letting you in. We're not letting you in because you have some right to be here. We're not letting you in because you're in trouble and you need a safe place to come. We're letting you in because we believe you're going to provide enough value to justify our letting you in. This is our thing that you want. We get to decide whether we want you to have it, whether you want your arrival brings enough positive that it's a good deal for us. That should be the frame that immigration is understood through. And so, as a consequence, when people talk about Islamic immigration in the Middle East, in Europe, the answer is start there. Stop asking whether or not this person needs to come in. Start asking whether or not you need them there. It's not their right to come in. It's your responsibility as the guardians of the borders of your sovereign nation to make sure that those who do immigrate bring value rather than bring a liability. You want to structure your policy to be as tailored as possible so that it can treat individuals as individuals to the extent that it's possible. And to the extent that you need to have rules that say, okay, this class of people is excluded or included or whatever, those need to be as tailored as possible. You want to make sure that when individuals will provide net value to the country and that they don't bring with them liabilities that render them unfit for civil society as we understand it, then that they are able to get through. But the biggest priority ought to be that people who do bring liabilities that make them unfit for civil society don't get through. In other words, unlike the criminal justice system, which needs to prioritize protecting the innocent from wrongful conviction over convicting people who might or might not be innocent, immigration policy works the other way. Because those people are asking permission to come in, we need to prioritize making sure that the burden's on them to establish their net value and lack of liability. It's not on us to make sure not to exclude anybody unfairly. So we need to understand the burdens, we need to understand the framings, and we need to understand why immigration policy in Europe right now is so fucked up. Thoughts or questions
I
before I
feel
end
the
this video?
biggest.
Go ahead. I'm
I'm
sorry. Go ahead. Say what were you going to say?
I just think the biggest issue of people in Europe is they seem to have this idea that somehow immigrants are their responsibility, regardless whether they're in the border or not. For example, if we don't let in immigrants, it is our responsibility to let them in.
Right. That's wrong. That's backwards. And I just explained the entirety of why, and I hope all of Europe hears this. There are reasons why one ought to take on a given burden or not. And the reason that you should not with immigration policy is it's not like a criminal justice system where the burden ought to be on the state to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, or else the person who is on trial is presumed innocent. That's appropriate and consistent with justice. The borders mark the end of the sovereign state's responsibility for individuals. That's what defines a nation state. My government is responsible for the individuals, the citizenry within its nation, and is objectively, definitionally not responsible for individuals outside of the nation. So it is an attempt to dissolve the meaningful distinction of the nation state that has occurred in the EU and replace it with the idea of the EU while retaining all the mechanisms of the nation state. They create this contradiction and allow European policy to be so abjectly wrong. Any other thoughts before I end the video? Okay, well,
I think you covered it quite in depthly, Eric.
Thank you very much. And this is a video that's kind of explaining what my policy about this sort of stuff in terms of dealing with Europe, or at least my advice to Europe as president will be. I don't know if they're going to take it or not, but I'll explain to them why they're wrong, basically. And it's up to them to do what they're going to do. They're not my problem. That's what I'm getting at. It's not my problem to determine their policy. As president of the United States, I'm concerned about people in my country, right? All right, so that's how it's supposed to work, guys. All right, thanks for watching. Don't forget to eat plenty of cheese, and don't forget to vote. Eric Strauss for president 2020.